The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were described as a remarkable feat of engineering with an ascending series of tiered gardens containing a wide variety of trees, shrubs, and vines, resembling a large green mountain constructed of mud bricks. It was said to have been built in the ancient city of Babylon, near present-day Hilla, Babel province, in Iraq. According to one legend, the Hanging Gardens were built alongside a grand palace known as the Marvel of Mankind, by King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled between 605 and 562 BC, for his Median wife, Queen Amytis, because she missed the green hills and valleys of her homeland. This was attested to by the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in about 290 BC, a description that was later quoted by Josephus. The Hanging Gardens are the only one of the 7 wonders for which the location has not been definitively established. There are no extant Babylonian texts that mention the gardens, and no definitive archaeological evidence has been found in Babylon. This lack of evidence has had archaeologists and historians looking elsewhere for answers, and that is where King Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, comes into the picture. Sennacherib was the king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the death of his father Sargon II in 705 BC to his own death in 681 BC. The second king of the Sargonid dynasty, Sennacherib is one of the most famous Assyrian kings for the role he plays in the Hebrew Bible, which describes his campaign in the Levant. After the final war with Babylon, which resulted in its destruction in 689 BC, Sennacherib dedicated his time to improving his new capital at Nineveh rather than embarking on large military campaigns. Nineveh had been an important city in northern Mesopotamia for millennia. The oldest traces of human settlement at its location are from the 7th millennium BC, and from the 4th millennium BC and onward it formed an important administrative center in the north. When Sennacherib made the city his new capital, it experienced one of the most ambitious building projects in ancient history, being completely transformed from the somewhat neglected state it had been in before his reign. Whereas his father's new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, was an imitation of the previous capital of Nimrud, Sennacherib intended to make Nineveh into a city whose magnificence and size astonished the civilized world. The earliest inscriptions discussing the building project at Nineveh date to 702 BC and concern the construction of the Southwest Palace, a large residence constructed in the southwestern part of the citadel. Sennacherib called this palace the Palace Without Rival. During the construction process, a smaller palace was torn down, a stream of water which had been eroding parts of the palace mound was redirected, and a terrace which the new palace was to stand on was erected and raised to the height of 160 layers of brick. Though many of these early inscriptions talk about the palace as if it were already completed, this was the standard way of writing about building projects in ancient Assyria. The Nineveh described in Sennacherib's earliest accounts of its renovation was a city which at that point only existed in his imagination. By 700 BC the walls of the Southwest Palace's throne room were being constructed, followed shortly by the many reliefs to be displayed within it. The final step in the palace's construction was the erection of colossal statues depicting bulls and lions, characteristic of late Assyrian architecture. Though such stone statues have been excavated at Nineveh, similar colossal statues mentioned in the inscriptions as being made of precious metals remain missing. The roof of the palace was constructed with cypress and cedar recovered from the mountains in the west, and the palace was illuminated through multiple windows and decorated with silver and bronze pegs on the inside and glazed bricks on the outside. The full structure, going by the mound it was built on, measured 1,480 foot long and 720 foot wide. Sennacherib constructed beautiful gardens at his new palace, importing various plants and herbs from throughout his empire and beyond. Cotton plants may have been imported from as far away as India. Besides the palace, Sennacherib oversaw other building projects at Nineveh. He built a large second palace at the city's southern mound, which served as an arsenal to store military equipment and as permanent quarters for part of the Assyrian standing army. Numerous temples were built and restored, many of them on the Kuyunjik Mound, including a temple dedicated to the god Sin. Sennacherib also massively expanded the city to the south and erected enormous new city walls, surrounded by a moat, up to 82 foot high and 49 foot thick. Oxford scholar Stephanie Daly has proposed that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were these well-documented gardens. Daly believes that during the intervening centuries Nineveh and Babylon became confused, and the extensive gardens at Sennacherib's palace were attributed to Nebuchadnezzar II's Babylon. Archaeological excavations have found traces of a vast system of aqueducts attributed to Sennacherib by an inscription on its remains, which Daly proposes were part of an 50-mile series of canals, dams, and aqueducts used to carry water to Nineveh, with water-raising screws used to raise it to the upper levels of the gardens. Daly based her arguments on the following points. Number 1, the name Babylon, meaning Gate of the Gods, was the name given to several cities at the time. Sennacherib renamed the city gates of Nineveh after gods, which suggests that he wished his city to be considered a Babylon. Number 2, only Josephus names Nebuchadnezzar as the king who built the gardens. Although Nebuchadnezzar left many inscriptions, none mentions any garden or engineering works. Diodorus Siculus and Quintus Curtius Rufus specify a Syrian king. By contrast, Sennacherib left written descriptions, and there is archaeological evidence of his water engineering. His grandson Assurbanipal pictured the mature garden on a sculptured wall panel in his palace. Number 3, Sennacherib called his new palace and garden a wonder for all peoples. He describes the making and operation of screws to raise water in his garden. Number 4, the descriptions of the classical authors fit closely to these contemporary records. Before the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander the Great camped for 4 days near the aqueduct at Jerwin. The historians who traveled with him would have had ample time to investigate the enormous works around them, recording them in Greek. These first-hand accounts have not survived into modern times but were quoted by later Greek writers. King Sennacherib's garden was well known not just for its beauty as a year-round oasis of lush green in a dusty summer landscape, but also for the marvelous feats of water engineering that maintained the garden. It wasn't just Sennacherib that had a reputation for garden building. Other Assyrian kings before him had developed gardens. King Ashurnasirpal II had created a canal, which cut through the mountains. Fruit tree orchards and various variety of trees had been planted, as well as quince, fig, and grapes. A sculptured wall panel of Assurbanipal shows the garden in its maturity. Several features mentioned by the classical authors are discernible on these contemporary images. Of Sennacherib's palace, he mentions the massive limestone blocks that reinforced the flood defenses. Parts of the palace were excavated by Austin Henry Layard in the mid-19th century. His citadel plan shows contours which would be consistent with Sennacherib's garden, but its position has not been confirmed. The area has been used as a military base in recent times, making it difficult to investigate further. The irrigation of such a garden demanded an upgraded water supply to the city of Nineveh. The canal stretched over 31 miles into the mountains. Sennacherib appreciated the technology he had employed and describes them in detail on his inscriptions. At the headwater of Bavian, his inscription mentions automatic sluice gates. An enormous aqueduct crossing the valley at Jerwin was constructed of over 2 million dressed stones. It used stone arches and waterproof cement. Sennacherib claimed that he had built a wonder for all peoples, and said he was the first to deploy a new casting technique instead of the older precision casting method for his monumental bronze castings used to make the water screws. As a result, he was able to bring the water into his garden at a high level because it was sourced from further up in the mountains, and he then raised the water even higher. This allowed him to build a garden that towered above the landscape with large trees on the top of the terraces, a stunning artistic effect that surpassed those of his predecessors and which most likely gave the visual that inspired the recorded description of the terraced hanging gardens in Babylon. Given the total lack of evidence regarding the hanging gardens having been in Babylon, Dark Histories believes that Stephanie Dalley has got it spot on. The gardens were in fact in Nineveh, and it was Sennacherib who created them.